Back in 1974, my parents were still living in upstate New York. And so I decided, rather than drive, that I would fly home for Thanksgiving. I was in graduate school at the time at St. John's Seminary in Plymouth, and I was a little late in making the reservation, so as a consequence, there was no Sunday flight back. I had to come back on Saturday. And when I left the airport on Saturday evening, it was already snowing. And those of you who might remember back to November of '74, to that Thanksgiving weekend, it snowed, and it snowed, and it snowed, and it snowed. By Monday morning, there were 2 feet of snow on the ground, and everything in southeastern Michigan was paralyzed. As a result, many of my schoolmates never made it back to the seminary at the end of the weekend, and so on Monday morning, there was just about a half dozen, or maybe a dozen of us back. And there were 8 or so of us having breakfast when the rector, the head of the seminary, came in and said, "Gentlemen, I received a call from Northville State Hospital, which was kitty corner from the seminary at 5 Mile and Sheldon. And they were asking if we could come over and give the staff there some relief." What had happened is that, they were snowed in and they weren't able to get new people in. So the people that worked there had been working since Saturday night, all day Sunday, and they just needed a break. And so could we come over and help feed some of the patients their lunch? And so there were about 8 of us that went over, and trudging through the snow, we made our way over to the hospital and were greeted at the door by one of the staff who began to take us on a tour. And it was a very eye-opening experience, to say the least. Northville State Hospital was a place for those who were physically and mentally, emotionally disabled in severe cases. And as they were leading us from one ward to the next, I just became overwhelmed and depressed by what was happening to human beings. And I began to question God very quickly and asking, why? How could you allow people to be like this? And then at some point, I don't know what happened, but all of a sudden, it was like somebody said, "David, hello?" And I started to look around, and each one of these wards only had like 8 or 10 patients, and they had several staff people. And the walls were all brightly colored, and they had bigger-than-life Disney characters on the walls. And they were clean wards. It wasn't like they weren't cared for. And it struck me at that moment that, what does it say about our society that we take care of these who are the least able to care for themselves and do it so well? Not only that, but, it all of a sudden was this moment where I thought, maybe the reason why God allows things like this to happen is so that we could learn to love and to care for them. And that really became in force when I was given a patient to feed lunch. I don't know how old she was, but she was by no means a kid, but had the ability of about a 5-year-old. And I was a new face. And she just chatted away, and she was as happy as could be that I would be willing to sit there and feed her lunch. And I remember being so taken by the fact that, here was an opportunity to just give a little bit, but that made another so happy. And I remember that lesson. I wish I could remember her name, but I've got to tell you, it's 50 years and I'm still claiming chemo fog. But I will never forget the lesson I learned that day. And it was really an important lesson. That giving to others is really that important. You know, I thought of that yesterday morning. Yesterday was an interesting day. You know, quiet little St. Mark. We had a funeral at 10, a baptism at noon, a wedding at 1:30. We had penance at 4:30, and then we had Mass at 5:30, and I anointed 2 people afterwards. The only thing we didn't do yesterday was an ordination. And we didn't have time to fit that in. But the funeral in the morning, what had happened is that early in the morning, when I had gotten up and had breakfast and prayed, and I started to look at the readings for today again, to put together the ideas that I've had all week long into a homily, I thought of the woman whose funeral we celebrated yesterday. And she was a woman who struggled in life. The last 20 years of her life, she lived with a disability several disabilities, and yet made it her passion to reach out to her nieces and nephews and make their life better, to bring them joy and happiness. She did that all of her life, but even in her infirmities, in her difficulties, did that. You know, and it really struck me that she was another lesson in the gospel that we hear today. In the gospel, we hear about the disciples. They're arguing about who's the most important. And you can kind of figure out what was that. You know, Peter, of course, would say, well, I'm the rock. I'm the most important, you know. I'm the one. Didn't the Lord single me out? And Thomas said, don't flatter yourself. Don't flatter yourself. I doubt really, Peter, that you're that important. You know, the rest of us, you know, and Philip said, wait a minute, guys. Remember when we had that problem with all that big crowd and who was going to feed them? The Lord turned to me and asked what we were supposed to do. And Judas jangled a purse of money and said, excuse me? I just wanted to point out that the Lord made me the treasurer of the group. I'm the one that he singled out. And they're arguing about this as they go along. And Jesus has just told them again that he's come to give his life for us and to us, even to allow that life to be taken from us. And they still don't get it. And Jesus said, if you want to be the most important, you have to make yourself the smallest. Now, if you were to look for that word in Latin, it's to make oneself smaller. It's to make oneself mini or minister. We have to minister to the others. That's what it means, to make oneself less, to make the other more important. Now, I don't remember the classes I took that year at St. John's. I remember some of those professors that taught me. But I probably learned the most important lesson that year, that snowy Monday morning after Thanksgiving, when I went across to Northville State Hospital and just served a meal to someone who couldn't feed herself. She taught me a great deal. She taught me the lesson that Jesus is trying to teach us all, that to love means to give, that in the end, it doesn't matter how much you have, but rather how much you have given. That is what makes for the greatest in the kingdom of God. And so again, we gather to celebrate the one who made himself servant to us all, who gave his life for us and to us, so that you and I, who celebrate that love, can go out there and live it in a way that makes it real to our sisters and brothers who desperately need to see that love and to be taught the lesson of love once more.